This portion of the Platforum is brought to you by Revue, the fastest way to bring the illusion of 3D detail to the insides of your model railroad structures. And by Fast Tracks, helping the world build better railroads with a complete line of high-quality hand tools, specially selected for hand-laying track work.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Platform, the podcast for the rail fan and the model railroader alike. We're coming to you from our very own station platform. Where are we? On the north shore of Lake Ontario, halfway between Toronto, well, not halfway, we're somewhere in the middle there, between Toronto and Montreal, along a very busy rail corridor hosting 40 to 50 trains a day. There's never really a dull moment here on The Platform. In addition to our 3 studio cameras, we also have a Railstream webcam that we have access to. We can tap into and we can feature, speak of the devil, we can feature the action that's going by trackside. I'm going to hold off on an introduction of our guests until our third guest makes themselves known, and I hear our third guest coming now. That stainless steel never gets old.
No.
I'm joined today on the platform with Via Rail locomotive engineer and my friend, Jordan McCallum. Jordan, welcome.
Thank you.
Next to Jordan is Eric Gagnon. Eric is a model railroader. He is the creator of the Trackside Treasure blog, and he is also the author of now 4, Eric?
That's correct.
4 volumes of Via Rail books. And so today we are going to talk about our memories of Via Rail and how it has changed over the years. Guys, I think everybody knows a little bit about my history. I grew up in Woodstock, Ontario, along the Dundas sub. We had CP in the north end of town. My grandparents lived in the south part of Woodstock along the Dundas sub, just east of the Via station. And my earliest memories of Via, and they're still the warmest memories I have of Via, because I don't have a Via paycheck. My warmest memories of Via Rail is the best thing is when an eastbound would come into Woodstock, it would round the corner by the old Purina Mill, they'd roll under the old Wellington Street Bridge, that old iron and timber bridge. It'd make a station stop. It'd probably be winter time. There'd be an FPA4 on the point, maybe a B, maybe not, a steam heater car for sure, and a string of CC and F coaches of all the different flavors. And to me, they were just coaches. That's all I knew. And the station stop would be made, and you could look down the track, and with those FPA4s, Jordan, you know it, you could hear it. You could hear the belch, you could hear the throttle tug, and you could see the black smoke rise, the steam's hissing away, and then slowly it would build speed. It would come eastbound over Wilson Street and Norwich Ave crossing back then. And it was slightly upgrade to Eastwood, to the east of town. I'm pretty sure that the throttle was wide open at that point. The smoke was belching skyward.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, and I would just watch this sea of blue and yellow go by. That was Via Rail for me growing up. I know there have been some changes. Before we talk about where Via is at now and some of those changes over the years, what's the Via you remember as a kid at Stratford?
I'm very similar, where we're close to the same age. So for me, it was the old RDCs. You know, they were common on the backway, which was the north line between Silver, which is Georgetown, and London Junction. And about 10 trains a day, 4 or 5 each way, all Bud cars.
They were all Bud cars?
Predominantly. I think there was the odd conventional consist, but there was a lot of Bud cars, and they would be in sets of like 3 to 5 and sometimes bigger trains. And I remember that specifically at Stratford, and that was like the connection to the rest of the Via network, where it was FPA4s, F9s, the LRC equipment, and all the Blue Fleet.
What year was LRC? Was it 81?
81.
81 LRC came in. I remember seeing my first LRC at Woodstock thinking, what on earth is that thing?
I was lucky. I was in Ottawa when the inaugural train came out. It was a display train. They had the platform all decorated.
We saw it in Kingston.
And the public had an opportunity to go and check out this new equipment. And I remember as a kid being able to go on the LRC equipment, which now I work with on a couple times a week. So
isn't that neat?
It is. It's history coming full circle.
Yeah. Eric, talk to me about Via then for you.
Well, being slightly more seasoned than you and Jordan, I actually remember CN.
Thanks, Dad.
And but having said that, I was there for the beginning of Via, like the very beginning when it was Via CN with those little...
And when was that, for the sake of our audience?
As far as, it's a bit of debate on that. Was it 76, 77, or 1978? There's different anniversaries in there. For me, I look at it as 76, because that's when I first saw it. But, so we were there when that switched over, so I can remember the turbo in the CN black and white. But I can also remember the turbo being one of the first things that appeared in blue and yellow. So through Kingston, we had trains to Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, and it was all blue and yellow. We had some dayliners as well, or some bud cars coming through there. But the thing that's different from what we're seeing here now, they were long trains. I call them platform fillers at Kingston. But the reason they were long is because they had a lot of extra cars that are built into the current consist. So we had a baggage car, we had a club car, we had a meal service car. Now you have service at your seat. You generally have your own baggage with you. So the trains are a lot shorter. And people say, well, the trains are short. Yeah, but back then they were longer, but there were fewer of them. You get nearly 30 trains a day past here that are Via. I think there was, I don't know, look at the different years, 8, 10, 12 per day. It's quite a different picture than what there is today.
Did Via Rail ever carry mail? You know, you hear of the RPO and the US lines. Did Via ever carry mail or high-class merchandise?
Off the top of my head, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I think that was done by the time Via.
That would be a CN and CP legacy.
Yeah,
legacy
probably
thing.
like most things in the States, you could look at when that evaporated on Amtrak, and we're probably maybe after that or maybe at the same time. But once those mail contracts dried up and vehicle transport was used more and more, I'm pretty sure Via missed that.
Yeah. So Via for you was in the formative years.
Yeah. So my rail fanning started in 1976. That's when I first started writing down these numbers, and it's really hard for me to be here and not be writing stuff down and yelling into that tape recorder, but I'm doing okay. And that's when I started, and for whatever reason, was 76.
On the American side, we talk about Amtrak and the formation of Amtrak, which I believe was 71 or 2, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Do you know which, just for precision's sake?
I want to say 71.
71, I do too. Does that sound right?
I think
so. Yeah. They talk about the formative years of Amtrak, and they refer to it as Amtrak's rainbow era, where all the legacy roads came together.
Right.
I think I hear our third guest.
I think it's a Via.
Let's hold that thought. Speaking of Via,
there's those real mixed consists.
Yeah.
can you get any more Via now than that?
That's very now.
That's Via right now.
It's short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talk about, there's talk about, and there's fans of Amtrak's rainbow era. Let me ask you, Eric, because you lived it. We were just young little fellers back then,
You
Jordan.
guys.
Did Via have a rainbow era?
Not to the same extent. Certainly not in the corridor. There was no, the history of it was it came as part of CN.
Can I interrupt you, Eric?
Sorry.
When you say the corridor, can you explain that to our audience?
Windsor, southwestern Ontario, through to Toronto, through Kingston, Montreal, Ottawa, Quebec City.
Okay, so sort
That
of
would
the
be the limits of
401,
it.
the
The big
rail lines that
cities,
parallel the 401
Southern
corridor.
Ontario,
Okay.
southern Quebec.
So when you say corridor trains, that's what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, going out west, there was a rainbow era, for sure, because the way that started, it was CN trains and CP trains would meet in Winnipeg and switch cars. So there was definitely a mixing of sleeping cars and use of dining cars interchangeably, but not so much here. The only time I saw any of that here over that time was around 79, 80. Business was still good. There were some airline strikes and bus strikes around that time. Via got very hungry for equipment. So they would bring in the odd Algoma Central, maybe Ontario Northland, and maybe even CP cars to run through here between Montreal and Toronto.
Via's flagship train historically has always been the Canadian, Train 1 and Train 2, and then of course there was the split and the coming together at Sudbury that happened with 11 and 12. There was a bit of a sort of a rainbow era on the Canadian, was there not?
The peak of it was 79.
79.
And I want to go back and look at that some more because I haven't really explored that. I did get a little bit of that riding the train out west, and it made it very interesting. Once you got into the mid-80s, a lot of that equipment was sidelined because, especially with the 81 cuts, 1981 cuts to via rail service. There's a lot of oddballs. So any small car series, sidetrack.
A friend of mine rode the Canadian in the 70s when it was actually CP. It was a pure CP train.
Right.
And I'm not sure how he obtained it, and we will not divulge any details. He tells me legally, but he has one of the original Canadian Pacific blankets out of one of the sleeping cars, and it is the most gorgeous garment you've ever seen. It's got, I believe the Canadian Pacific is in red script.
Could be.
I think it's in red,
Yeah.
and it's just a beautiful blanket, and it's just a touchstone to an earlier era in rail travel.
I think most, if not all of those, were made in the Ayers, that's AYERS factory in Lachute, Quebec, which is where some of my relatives are from, right in town. So, but even riding via in those early years out west, 81, I literally had a CN blanket and a CP Beaver Crest blanket in sleeping cars I was in, still in use. They had lots of wear still left in them. Why are we going to get rid of these things? We're cash strapped. There they were.
Well, and I think a lot of them too probably cascaded down to being supplied in vans, cabooses, or on work trains. So a lot of them existed up until maybe not that long ago when a lot of that was all phased out. So you could find the odd relic that would
Jordan,
carry
you're
on.
26 years railroader.
Coming up, yep.
What year did you hire out with Via?
I started with Via in 2009.
2009. So let's call it 10 years.
Yep.
You must have seen, even in the last decade, being on the job there, some huge changes, even in the last 10 years.
There have. We used to use the Renaissance equipment here in the corridor, which now that is slowly being pushed just in service between Montreal and Halifax, with maybe one train set or two train sets that goes between Ottawa and Quebec City.
What's Renaissance equipment?
So that was a fleet of equipment that Via was able to obtain from England.
Oh, okay.
And in the 90s, we needed more cars, so we needed them quick. And they had a bargain basement price on this equipment, and Via
Float them over.
Via floated them over. They came over in basically kit form, and they went to Thunder Bay, and they were put together to Via specifications, and we used that for quite a while here in the corridor.
I'm totally putting you on the spot, and if you don't know the answer, that's fair. Do you have even a rough guesstimate of how many pieces of Renaissance equipment there was at one time, or what's on
I'm not sure what
fleet
the total
today?
was. I want to say it was over 130 or
I
140.
want to say 130 some. Yeah,
Yeah,
I can look it up
130
there,
cars.
but let's not take time doing that. But I think you're right. I
But
think
that's
it's
good for a rough
130.
number.
Yeah.
Yep.
130
It was
pieces.
a good fleet.
And they
Yeah.
all
Big
came
fleet.
across the ocean on,
They did.
on a boat.
Yeah.
Now, not all of them were put in
Finished.
service.
Yeah.
A lot were just empty shells that stayed up at the plant in Thunder Bay.
Oh, okay.
And were
Part
only
source
recently
or
scrapped.
whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there quite a bit of that 130? Is there still a fair amount of Renaissance equipment still?
All
on
the
those?
equipment still exists. It's all mostly in storage
Oh,
at
okay.
Montreal, which is like the main hub for maintenance for them. So
I think we'd have to talk about the differences in the English climate. I think they're originally intended for the Channel, and so the English climate versus the Canadian climate.
Yeah.
And so this is what we experienced you on Via, and me trackside, was watching Via fight the elements with old equipment.
Yeah.
And this was a way to maybe try some new equipment, which maybe wasn't 100% suited to the Canadian climate,
Yeah.
but was a long ways better than the old steam heated equipment that was from the 50s.
We definitely have challenging conditions in Canada that can test the metal of railway equipment.
and I think no matter what the industry is, as Canadians, we're very we make it work. We make it happen.
Resourceful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, World War II, we came out of it, you know, being incredibly strong, and we've done the same with the Renaissance equipment. Like
Yeah.
it's not the best, not the most ideal equipment, but
Yeah.
we made it work.
But if you give a Canadian a roll of duct tape and some baling wire, we'll make it work.
We will.
No.
We're a resourceful lot.
Now that sounds like a TV show right there.
It sure does. Yeah. It might have something to do with signal indications.
Yes.
Eric, you've got 4 books on Via. Walk me through the Coles notes of the 4 volumes.
Well-
And are they a chronology? Are they based on geography?
Yeah.
How does it work?
It all started out with note taking, and a fellow from Ottawa named Jacob Mueller said, "I'd like a copy of your notes." And I thought to myself, how do you copy an entire shoebox of little notepads? Well, you don't. So I transferred them into book form. This is the second book that we have here, but the first book was 2,700 consists right from 76 or shortly before up to 2011. That was the first one. But what I heard a lot was, well, there's nothing for my part of the country. What about where I was? So this book was an attempt to deal with some of that. And it grew into a third book, which was more conscious. And then in 2017, I updated things and talked about a little of the research and some of the rides I'd taken on Via, and my dad even, and some of those stories.
So they're not just picture books.
No.
There's a lot of, they're probably maybe less a picture book.
They're not a coffee table book. There's photos, data, and information, but it's really a very niche market of people that, like Jordan, who maybe worked on Via, or people who rode Via. And if you divide up the Canadian Railway pie, Via is actually a very small slice. It doesn't go back 100 and some years like the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of people like to model Via, because it is very modelable. It's a small fleet. There's only so many eras that it went through, and you can pick and choose your part of the network.
I see.
Yeah.
Again, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
Got a fifth book in mind?
No.
No?
No.
The Via book chapter has come to
at this point,
an
yes.
End.
Yeah.
Jordan, talk to us a little bit about, as much as you can, about Via now. And maybe before you do that, your 10 years on Via, give us a snapshot of what Via was like in 2009 and maybe where it is now, and then maybe where we're headed with Via.
I think right now the future is pretty bright. We're expecting new equipment starting to arrive in 2022. So it's going to be built by Siemens down in Sacramento, California. So they're just in the design phase right now. And we're going to be seeing new equipment. Hopefully, maybe next winter we'll get the first consist, and they're going to do winter testing.
I was just going to ask about, we just talked about the channel and climate, and I'm thinking Sacramento, California, Via equipment.
I know, and a lot of the equipment that Siemens has already produced, it's only in use in warmer U.S. states. So,
welcome to Winnipeg.
Well, welcome to
Winterpeg.
The corridor where the wind chills will be in the minus 30s and 40s. You're going to have the blowing snow that's going to get inside. You have to be careful. You can't be too automated because automatic steps don't like snow and ice. So we have to basically go old school and maybe have manually operated steps and doors. Mm-hmm. And just make sure that all the components, like there's going to be heat tracing on all the plumbing to make sure that your toilets work, your water still flows. And it's going to be an exciting time. Like in the 10 years, we've added a lot more trains, especially in the Toronto to Ottawa market. Mm-hmm. There's been a big increase in the amount of trains.
I guess the challenge with a typical passenger car is there's not a lot of heated, insulated area to run infrastructure. In other words, you've got airlines and for brakes and for operating air, and you've got water and you've got wastewater, and a lot of that infrastructure is underslung, isn't it? And,
very much so.
Cold, and you've got snow and ice kicking out.
We're all self-contained, and you don't want to have failures en route, because if a consist is permanently coupled, you don't have the luxury of switching out a bad car and putting in a good one, or spending time thawing out a consist in the shop, which is often what you had to do. You just had to wait for it to warm up. We don't have that luxury. Like all our equipment now, there's tight turnarounds. So we need relatively maintenance-free, where it's just fill up the water, restock the galley, and get your next load of passengers, and there's a new trip.
And from a train watching perspective, it used to be great to stand on the Spadina Avenue footbridge, watch these consists come in from the coach yard, or Bathurst Street, or wherever, anywhere in that corridor. And you'd see the little CN switcher pulling these things to and fro. But now, that train comes in that you're bringing into Toronto, another crew is taking that to Ottawa right after that, within a couple hours or whatever the turnaround. So there's not that back and forth, pull out a car, stick in a car. And a train watching opportunity I missed recently is when they took one of those original Siemens cars to Ottawa. Mm-hmm. It would have gone past here, and it was a single car train for CN. They had a big high horsepower unit on that thing, and they took it with the idea of taking it to Ottawa for cold weather testing.
Yeah, I'm going to NRC, National Research Council.
Yeah.
They basically put it in a freezer and they subject it to all their tests.
And I just missed it. Anyway, good pictures. I saw some excellent pictures of it going past here.
Do they
Neat
do that
movement.
with Via Railroaders too? Put you in the freezer? And
Well, that's why they give us these nice warm coats.
See how you make
That's
out?
why it's so incredibly well preserved.
Yeah.
Jordan, when you started in 09, tell us about your first trip.
I think my first trip was on the Backway, which is actually a run that I'm on now, between Toronto and London, by way of Guelph, Kitchener, Stratford. So for me, it was like growing up in Goderich, spending a lot of time in Stratford at the train station. It was kind of like that full circle effect where it was kind of cool to have that as your maiden run.
What'd you have as equipment on your first run? In terms
Well,
of power?
It was probably a 6400 on the Backway. I, much like your book and all the information, I keep a time book. So every time I go to work, I know I can look back for my entire career pretty much, with the exception of a few gaps, and I can tell you what I worked on what day, the power that I had, and I don't keep car numbers as far as consists, but I can tell you if I had 5 LRC cars or 3 HEP or a combination. So whether I worked the Backway on southwestern Ontario or to Montreal, or the odd time when I worked number 1 between Toronto and Cape-Breton, I can tell you the power. So we only have 2 kinds of power now, the 6400s and the 900s, so they both have pros and cons. But
I don't know if you remember this, but I remember one wintry night, you and I being at a mutual friend's for a Christmas party. It was a model railroad thing, and I remember your cell phone going off. I think you were sitting beside me. I think we had our face full of lasagna or something. And I remember you having to say, Merry Christmas, boys, I got to roll, because you were called for number 1, I believe, and you had to report to the Toronto Maintenance Center for number 1. Do you remember that?
vaguely, yeah, it's starting to come back to me now.
Yeah, I'm younger than you, right? Memory's a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit sharper.
I hear our third guest here.
Yeah.
While we're waiting for the third guest to arrive, do you have any interest in modeling Via? Are your modeling interests there, or your modeling interests elsewhere, something different from work?
Definitely Via for me. Fond memories as a kid, because my grandparents lived right near the Via station in Ottawa, so I would spend a lot of time. It was a 500-foot walk down to the fence where I could watch the Toronto to Montreal, or the Ottawa to Montreal trains go by. And especially in the winter, I remember that squirrel tail of steam shooting out the back, and I would watch the Montreal section of the Canadian go by. And definitely that I wanted to work at Via, and I also wanted to model. And as a kid, you would get those old River Rossi models, the Mantua models, and you would make them Via.
Yeah. Hey, Jordan, you're interrupted by our third guest.
And with a lot of imagination, you made your Via train back before the models that we now are able to get from Rapido. You had to use a little bit more imagination back then. And I started my career in the winter. I very much liked the snow, and I would take the can of snow that you would use to decorate a Christmas tree, and I would spray the side of my Via train with that. Just a recommendation.
Yeah,
Don't
do that
because it does not come off.
Yeah, that reminds me of my very first weathering attempt. Little known fact: when I was a youngster, I fell in love with the Southern Pacific with that scarlet nose and the gray with the SP on the nose.
Yeah.
And I remember 2 of my better quality engines as a kid were Athearn Blue Box, right? Because I had the early models had a single powered truck, like like a Lifelike F or something, right? So Athearn was a big upgrade, and I remember I had a GP40 in SP, and I had I think Athearn calls it an SW9, or they called it an SW1200, but it's a 9 or a 7 or whatever it is. Yeah,
some
1500. That's it. So we all remember Flowquill, our favorite paint ever that we can't get anymore. Well, Flowquill used to make this product called Instant Railroad Weathering or something, and it was basically a rattle can of beige grime. Yeah, so like 10-year-old me takes these beautiful scarlet and gray Atherton blue box models and gives the rattle can a shake, and you know what happened? There was no more scarlet, it was all gray. That's my first weathering. Eric, speaking of VIA and models, I know you're a model railroader. Do you have you have such a love for VIA. Does that percolate down into your modeling interests or no?
Strangely, no.
No.
All I really modeled in VIA was a very basic F40. You did a paint scheme on it. But I defer to a lot of guys out there who pre-Rapido era or even during the Rapido era do a lot of their own scratch building, decaling. Feature Tim Heyman's work in one of my books, because he did a lot of things from across the VIA spectrum, from the former BC Rail scenic cars right through to the Kool-Aid F40, and did it on his own and want to do that way. And even Paul Hunter in Kingston, that's part of our club in Kingston, has done a lot with VIA modeling. So I defer to those guys. Yeah.
Well, guys, I want to thank you for joining me on this nice, warm, crisp, toasty day here on the platform. I don't know about you guys, but I want to go watch me some switching, and I'm going to have you guys join me.
Okay.
We'll say goodbye to everybody for today. Thank you so much for joining us on the platform. Remember, if you want to see more of us, you can find us on the YouTube at the Platforum, and also be sure to check out our audio-only podcast called The Platform, the Station House audio series, which streams on Spotify. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.